Hey guys, tonight we sink into the silk sheets of Versailles. Well, not literally, but close enough. You're about to trail Louis XIV through a single day of his life. And yes, it's as padded with rituals as a triple-layered pastry. Imagine the flicker of candles against endless gilded walls, the muffled scuffle of shoes on polished parquet floors, and the heavy scent of incense already clinging to your hair before breakfast. You're entering a world where the clock isn't just ticking, it's bowing, curtsying, and waiting for permission to keep moving. And you probably won't survive this schedule without nodding off, which, to be fair, is the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the dim corridors of Versailles in the gray pre-dawn, where the palace itself feels like it's exhaling in silence. Outside, the gardens are still cloaked in mist, but inside, the grand machinery of royal life begins to click into place. Louis XIV's day starts not with a yawn and a stretch, but with a stage-managed performance called The Lever, the waking up ritual. Forget your snooze button. This king had 30 nobles competing for the privilege of watching him blink awake. Imagine trying to stir from sleep with a full audience studying your eyelids. First, a valet whispers at the bedside, making sure the Sun King doesn't wake up in shock. Then the curtains part dramatically, as if even daylight needs royal permission to enter. Attendants swarm in with the precision of a pit crew, only instead of tires, they're handling pillows, slippers, and bedrobes. Historical records tell us the lever was tiered into categories. The petit lever, for the closest attendants, and the grand lever, where higher nobles filed in later like a kind of morning parade. Scholars still argue whether the king genuinely tolerated all this, or secretly longed for 5 extra minutes under the covers. One quirky detail? The bed itself was set on a raised platform, like a throne for sleeping. You might roll your eyes at the drama, but in this world, even gravity seemed to bow to protocol. Nobles jostled for the honor of passing Louis his wig stand, or, if truly lucky, helping him slip on a sleeve. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about hierarchy. Every gesture was a rung on the social ladder, and dropping the comb at the wrong moment could cost your family decades of influence. And while you're imagining this room full of men leaning over a groggy monarch, here's a fun fact. Louis XIV actually slept in a different chamber most nights, a private bedchamber tucked away. But come morning, he'd ceremoniously reappear in the official state bedroom, because even pretending to wake had to be political theater. Historians still debate just how much the nobles bought into this pantomime. Was it true reverence, or just very expensive cosplay? The sounds of the lever were hushed but layered. The scrape of chair legs as courtiers angled for better views, the soft hiss of poured water, and the rustle of papers being read aloud. Sometimes petitions, sometimes reminders of the day's schedule. You stand there half awake yourself, watching a monarch stretch one arm while a duke bows so deeply, you fear he'll never stand upright again. And yes, Louis XIV reportedly loved a good stretch, holding it just long enough that everyone in the room shared the moment of relief, like a communal yoga class with too much lace. But the ritual wasn't just empty pomp. It was designed to cement power, to remind every ambitious noble that access to the king, even to his bare feet on cold parquet, was the hottest ticket in France. By making his most private moments public, Louis kept the spotlight firmly on himself, controlling both who saw him and how. It was like living inside one long reality show, except you never got voted off. You just stopped getting invited into the room. And you, poor sleepy traveler, are wedged in the corner of the chamber, trying not to yawn as the king's eyelids flutter open. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath from the courtiers. Did he wake on the right side of the bed? Will today be favorable or furious? Imagine if your coworkers judged your mood based on the angle of your first stretch in the morning. The candlelight softens, the whispers settle, and Louis XIV sits up at last. A man on a stage who knows the entire kingdom is waiting for his next line. For you, though, the scene blurs into a cozy hum, the ritual repetition pressing against your eyelids like a lullaby. The king is now upright, which means the palace can officially start breathing again. You shuffle along in the current of silk and brocade as the nobles reposition themselves for the next act. Morning prayers. It isn't a long trek. Versailles is basically a cathedral stitched onto a mansion, stitched onto a bureaucratic office park. But every step feels measured, deliberate. Your slippers scuff faintly against the parquet as you trail behind, wondering how anyone could handle this routine before coffee was invented. Louis XIV moves in a slow, stately glide toward the chapel, attendants fanning out like ripples on water. He's not sprinting, he's practically floating because the point is never speed. The point is that everyone, from the grandest duke to the most nervous valet, knows exactly where they stand in the orbit of the Sun King. By the time he reaches the chapel doors, the scent of beeswax candles and polished wood fills your nose. A quiet reminder that this place is not just sacred, but choreographed. Inside the chapel, the ceiling soars with painted skies and gilded saints. You find a corner where you won't trip over anyone's train of fabric. Louis kneels, or rather, he makes a small, well-practiced gesture of kneeling that says, "I am pious," while also saying, "Don't wrinkle my lace." His prayers are brief but visible, a daily Instagram story of devotion in an age before Instagram. Historians still argue whether Louis was deeply devout or mainly pragmatic, using religion as a polished prop to reinforce his rule. You suspect it was both. He liked the ritual, but he liked the political advantage even more. The king murmurs, and the chapel echoes with the whispers of nobles, repeating the lines like a heavenly game of telephone. One mainstream fact here, Louis XIV never missed Mass. Not once in his 72-year reign. Rain, gout, political crisis, none of it excused him. Imagine scheduling your entire life around attending church and making sure your wig powder didn't get too close to the incense burner. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some courtiers reportedly pretended to pray extra hard just so the king would notice their posture and think, "Ah, yes, that guy's holy and loyal." You picture nobles angling their faces like models on a photo shoot, trying to catch the golden reflection of stained glass at just the right angle. If you've ever leaned conspicuously into your laptop camera on Zoom to look busier than you really are, you'd fit right in. The chapel service is brief, more a carefully placed comma than a paragraph. Yet its power is in its publicness. Every noble has seen the king's lips move in devotion. Every rival has clocked which duchess managed to stand closest to him. You stand there too, half fading into the incense fog, listening to the Latin chant roll like waves. The music is soft, almost hypnotic, and your eyelids droop as if the organ is playing a lullaby just for you. The ritual ends with another bow, and you shuffle back into the corridor with the others. Courtiers buzz quietly like bees in a hive. Who stood where? Who made eye contact? Who looked bored? It's Versailles' version of office gossip, except the stakes are enormous, and the dress code is 80 pounds of embroidered fabric. Louis exits with serene calm, already moving toward the next ritual. The real meat of the morning, hygiene. But before you go, you glance back into the chapel. The candles flicker as though the saints themselves are whispering, and you realize the prayers weren't just about God. They were about control, order, and spectacle. The same things that defined every hour of Louis's life. And you, poor sleep-heavy traveler, drift along with the crowd once more, lulled by the endless rustle of silk and the faint clatter of shoes against marble floors. The king's day has barely begun, but already you feel yourself sinking deeper into that rhythmic repetition, like a rocking cradle set to organ music. You drift back into the king's orbit, just as he's steered toward the next necessity of his day, hygiene. But if you're imagining a refreshing shower with foamy soap, brace yourself. Louis XIV's wash-up was not exactly a spa session. Water at Versailles was viewed with suspicion. Doctors of the time swore that submerging the body opened the pores to dangerous vapors, so cleanliness relied on linen, powders, and perfumes more than actual scrubbing. In other words, he smelled expensive rather than fresh. The attendants prepare the ritual like stagehands before a scene. Basins of water are carried in, gleaming in the candlelight, though only a few drops will ever touch royal skin. A valet dips cloth into the basin and gently dabs Louis's face, hands, and maybe arms. That's about as wet as the Sun King is going to get. Historians still argue whether Louis was genuinely fastidious or whether his legendary aversion to bathing was exaggerated by his critics. What's certain is that in a palace with thousands of rooms, there were very few baths and they were used rarely. A mainstream fact you can cling to. Linen undergarments were the true cleaning technology of the age. Louis changed his fine linen shirts multiple times a day, believing the cloth absorbed impurities and wicked away sweat. Imagine treating a shirt like a sponge and then ceremoniously handing it off to a duke, who practically wept with joy just to carry away the king's used laundry. Strange, but in this ecosystem of etiquette, touching even a discarded shirt was political gold. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the royal dental routine. Louis XIV had famously bad teeth. So bad, in fact, that surgeons once extracted most of them in a single session, leaving a hole in the roof of his mouth. They tried to plug it with a bit of metal, but it didn't work well, so food sometimes came out his nose. You're trying not to picture it, but there it is. Despite this, or maybe because of it, powders and rinses were used daily to keep whatever remained in tolerable condition. Think of mint-scented chalk dust rubbed against enamel. More desperate than effective. Perfume finishes the hygiene ritual. Attendants dab Louis with oils and fragrances, layers upon layers until he smells like a walking bouquet. Versailles itself was notorious for odors. Chamber pots, kitchens, unwashed bodies. So perfume wasn't indulgence. It was survival. You inhale faintly and catch lavender mixed with musk, heavy and cloying, a scent that insists on being noticed. While this is happening, nobles hover in the background. The Grand Chamberlain might hand over a comb. Another courtier positions the wig stand. You catch glimpses of envy in their eyes. Whoever touches the king's person today might find themselves rewarded tomorrow. Yet even here, amidst cloth and powder, the balance of power is rehearsed. Historians still debate whether the nobles genuinely cared for the ritual or whether they secretly mocked it in private. But standing there, you sense they had little choice. Mockery could mean exile, and exile meant irrelevance. For you, the scene blurs into sensory overload. The splash of water, the scrape of a comb against wig hair, the powder drifting like mist. The repetitive motions, the dabbing, the patting, the straightening, become hypnotic. You could almost close your eyes and imagine it as white noise, like the hum of a fan or the patter of rain. And as the king sits upright, his face dabbed clean, his hair arranged, his linen crisp, you realize that this whole wash-up ritual isn't just about hygiene. It's about performance. Louis XIV's body is a stage, and every attendant is part of the play. The king himself, he's both actor and audience, watching the nobility scramble for proximity to his skin. The ritual ends not with a towel toss, but with a satisfied nod. The Sun King is now refreshed by 17th century standards anyway, and ready for the next act. Getting dressed like no one else in Europe. For you, though, eyelids heavy with the smell of lavender and powder. It's like drifting in a warm bath you never actually took. The chamber fills again, but this time the air hums with anticipation. You're about to watch Louis XIV get dressed, and that might sound boring, like staring at someone pick socks in the morning, but here it's high political theater. Every button, every lace, every ribbon is a rung on the ladder of influence. Nobles don't just watch him get dressed, they fight for the honor of fastening a sleeve. Imagine office politics distilled into the act of holding out a shoehorn. Attendants bring in trays of garments, linen undershirts, stockings, breeches, waistcoats, and of course that towering wig. Each item is presented as if it were a holy relic. A valet carefully hands the shirt to the king, but not before a duke is given the honor of shaking it open. You blink, because yes, even unfolding fabric could be a job reserved for a nobleman. Historians still argue whether this elaborate layering genuinely impressed courtiers or if some secretly thought, really, I'm here to hand him a sock. But no one dared admit it. The mainstream fact. Louis XIV changed outfits multiple times a day. His morning attire, often heavily embroidered, was designed not for comfort, but for spectacle. Picture a jacket weighing nearly as much as a modern toddler, glittering with gold thread, and shoes buckled with jewels. And the wig, always the wig, an avalanche of curls spilling down past his shoulders. That hairpiece alone needed its own team of stylists, powdered until the room itself looked like a bakery in mid-shift. Now here's a quirky tidbit. The order of dressing wasn't just about clothes, it was about ranking courtiers. Only certain men could hand Louis his stockings. Others might be deemed worthy enough to pass him a cravat. Entire careers rose or fell, depending on which article of clothing you were trusted to touch. There are stories of nobles spending fortunes just to bribe their way into the shirt ceremony, because slipping linen over the king's shoulders meant everyone saw you close to power. Imagine LinkedIn endorsements, but instead of great communicator, your skill is handed Louis XIV a sleeve without dropping it. As layers pile on, the room grows stuffy, full of perfume and fabric dust. Louis stays calm, practiced, as if this whole ordeal is simply the air he breathes. You notice the way attendants bow slightly after each contribution, stepping back like stagehands retreating into the wings. The courtiers behind them murmur, calculating who got the best moment. If someone fumbled with a button, the gossip would ripple through Versailles before lunch. There's a debate historians still chew on. How much of this did Louis actually enjoy? Some say he reveled in it, using the ritual to keep nobles orbiting him like moths around a candle. Others believe he grew weary of the endless lace and bows, but tolerated it because it reinforced the system that kept him in power. Standing here, you sense a mix of both. He adjusts his wig with a flourish like a man who knows the show must go on, even if the costume itches. You, meanwhile, are entranced by the rhythm of it all. Shirt, bow, jacket, lace, stockings pulled taut, buckles clicked shut. The repetition is steady, almost musical, like a lullaby played out in buttons and silks. Your head tilts slightly as you watch a Marquise bend nearly double to offer a jeweled shoe, his dignity dissolving for the chance to tie a ribbon. When at last the ensemble is complete, Louis XIV stands transformed, a living sunbeam of fabric and gold. He glances in a mirror, though he hardly needs to. His courtiers' sighs of admiration tell him enough. The Sun King shines, but only because dozens of hands worked in careful choreography to ignite that glow. And as you drift with the others out of the chamber, the rustle of lace echoing in your ears, you realize the irony. The king's clothes were armor, theater, and politics rolled into one. But to you, they're also a soft blanket of sound and rhythm, pulling you deeper towards sleep. The dressing is complete, which means it's finally time for food, or at least something that passes for it. You expect a grand breakfast feast, but Versailles has its own definition of morning meal. Louis XIV did not lumber to a long table groaning with roasted meats. Instead, he often ate a modest breakfast right in bed, or at least in his bedchamber. You shuffle along with the courtiers, who half expect to witness some kind of culinary spectacle, and what arrives is bread, perhaps a cup of broth, and sometimes wine. Not exactly a royal buffet. The mainstream fact here, Louis XIV's official breakfast was small, almost symbolic. He preferred to save his appetite for the grander midday meal. In many cases, the ritual of breakfast mattered more than the calories. It was a performance like everything else. Nobles might hover just to see whether he reached for coffee, a luxury still exotic in 17th century France, or stuck with hot chocolate, another fashionable import. Yes, the Sun King had a sweet tooth, but he managed it with the same pomp he managed a hunting party. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes Louis actually ate nothing at breakfast. He would simply accept the tray, acknowledge it, and then push it aside untouched, while nobles still oohed and ahed over his restraint. Imagine your coworkers applauding you for ignoring your granola bar at a meeting. This was power, the ability to turn skipping breakfast into political theater. And still, gossip would swirl. Did you see? He didn't touch the bread. What does it mean? The room is hushed as servants carry in the silver trays. You watch as attendants pour steaming liquid into porcelain cups, the scent of chocolate mingling with the lavender already clinging to the king's linens. He dips bread into it, slowly, with the precision of someone who knows 50 eyes are following every crumb. Historians still argue whether he truly enjoyed these simple bites or whether the whole thing was staged as yet another demonstration of control. But as you watch, you can tell. Sometimes a man just wants his cocoa. Courtiers, meanwhile, pretend not to stare at the actual food. They can't eat until much later, so they hover like polite vultures, eyes darting from the king's spoon to his lips. A noble who carries a napkin too eagerly might be mocked, while another who offers a cup at just the right moment could win favor. You shift slightly on your feet, realizing the absurdity of the situation. Dozens of ambitious men and women waiting for one man to finish a crumb of bread. The sensory details sink in as the ritual stretches on. The faint clink of silver spoons, the soft slurp of liquid, the rustle of paper as a secretary reads aloud petitions or reports. It's multitasking in royal style. Eat, listen, nod. Outside the window, morning sunlight spills across Versailles Gardens, where fountains already splash in choreographed arcs. You can hear the faint trickle even inside, like background music underscoring the king's breakfast. There's a debate whispered among scholars about whether Louis's light breakfast reflected genuine dietary choice or medical necessity. Some argue his doctors encouraged modest meals to protect his digestion. After all, 17th century medicine was obsessed with balancing humors. Others think it was simply Louis's way of setting the stage for the lavish noon feasts. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same: a tiny snack wrapped in enormous ceremony. For you, the repetition of spoon, sip, nod, and silence becomes oddly soothing. The whole scene is like watching someone stir tea in slow motion, the rhythm steady, predictable, hypnotic. You blink slower, lulled by the cadence of silver against porcelain. The king sets down his cup, the courtiers murmur appreciation, and you find yourself wondering how something so small could feel so monumental. When the last crumb is cleared away and the tray carried out, the crowd exhales as if they've witnessed a miracle. The Sun King has eaten, or at least considered eating. The ritual is over and another layer of the day's performance slips into place. And as you shuffle out with the others, stomach still empty, you realize you've absorbed not just the details, but the rhythm. Every sound, every motion, every breath of incense is a gentle nudge toward drowsiness. Breakfast is finished. Ceremony continues. Your eyelids are heavier than the wig Louis wears before noon. You leave the breakfast chamber with the other courtiers, bellies empty but hearts full of reverence for a man who just sipped hot chocolate like it was a sacrament. Now the air grows heavier because the next act isn't silk and lace. It's paperwork. Yes, even the Sun King had to sit through meetings. You shuffle into a long chamber where sunlight cuts through tall windows, glinting off polished tables stacked with parchments. Quills wait like soldiers, ink pots lined in neat rows. Welcome to the Council of State. Louis XIV settles into his chair. Not just any chair, but the only armchair in the room. That detail is important. It physically reminds everyone else of their lesser status. Courtiers and ministers stand, some allowed to sit on stools if they're lucky, while the king leans into his documents like the ultimate office manager. Historians still argue whether Louis actually pored over every detail or simply orchestrated the performance of attention, but records suggest he was surprisingly diligent. often working for hours at a stretch. Mainstream fact: Louis XIV insisted on personally reviewing major decisions, from taxation schemes to war strategies. He believed that delegating too much weakened his authority. "I am the state," he famously declared, and here you can see it in practice. His signature on every decree, his voice deciding disputes. Imagine if your boss not only attended every meeting but insisted on personally signing every expense receipt. That was Louis, king of micromanagement. A quirky tidbit: during these councils, attendants sometimes held a special inkstand shaped like a small globe or elaborate animal just to add flair. The king's quills were trimmed to perfection, their points so sharp they might double as weapons. Ministers would nervously shuffle papers, aware that even the scratch of the pen could echo across the chamber like thunder. There are stories of nobles fainting in the heat of these meetings, not from boredom, though that was tempting, but from the sheer weight of the ritual. The room buzzes softly as the council begins. Secretaries read reports aloud, their voices blending with the scratch of pens. Louis listens, sometimes interrupting with a question so precise that ministers scramble to supply answers. You catch a hint of theater here too. Even his silence was a performance, making men sweat as they guessed his mood. Scholars still debate whether Louis's attention span was truly as disciplined as described. Some argue he daydreamed through portions, others insist he never missed a detail. Watching him now, you suspect both could be true, depending on how entertaining the speaker was. As you stand in the background, the rhythm of the council washes over you. Rustle, read, scratch. Rustle, read, scratch. The repetition has the same cadence as rain on a roof, only this rain involves budget lines and treaties. Your eyelids droop as the droning voices circle around issues of taxation, trade, or foreign alliances. Imagine a lullaby disguised as bureaucracy. Every so often, Louis nods, and the entire chamber seems to exhale. A nod could mean approval, denial, or simply acknowledgement, but no one dared to ask which. The ambiguity kept everyone on their toes. You can sense the courtiers calculating their every word, trying to balance between flattering the king and offering useful advice. The stakes are high, but for you, lulled by the rhythm, the scene becomes strangely peaceful. There's another quirky detail. Louis occasionally doodled while listening. Little sketches, swirls, or symbols have been found in the margins of official documents. Historians argue whether these were idle distractions or coded signals, but either way it makes you picture the Sun King as a bored student, scribbling suns in his notebook while the math teacher drones on. Hours slip by in this careful dance of formality. The ministers sweat, the king writes, the secretaries drone, and you sway gently with fatigue. It might be the only council meeting in history that could double as a guided meditation track. You breathe with the rhythm. Inhale on the rustle, exhale on the scratch. At last, Louis pushes back slightly from the table. A decree is sealed, papers stacked, and courtiers bow so low they might topple over. The Council of State has concluded, and the kingdom has been ruled for the morning. For the nobles, it's a day of decisions. For you, it's been like sinking into a warm sea of parchment and whispers, carried along by tides of protocol. The paperwork is done, the ink dried, the quills retired like overworked soldiers. Now the Sun King requires a different kind of performance. Fresh air, but fresh air scripted within the stage of Versailles itself. You shuffle through gilded doors into the dazzling gardens, where geometry has conquered nature. Every hedge is clipped into obedience. Every fountain arcs like it's rehearsed its line. This isn't a stroll, it's choreography. Louis XIV steps onto the gravel path, attendants fanning out behind him in perfect formation. You follow, crunching over the gravel that crackles underfoot like a steady drumbeat. This isn't about exercise, it's about display. The gardens are laid out like an open-air palace, and the king's promenade is as much a ritual as his lever. Historians still argue whether these daily walks were for genuine enjoyment or pure spectacle, But either way, they were never casual. Even a glance at a flower bed could be an act of power. The mainstream fact: Versailles Gardens, designed by André Le Nôtre, were meant to symbolize Louis's control over nature itself. The sunlit vistas stretched endlessly, radiating order and symmetry like the king's authority imposed on the land. When Louis strolled those paths, he wasn't just admiring flowers, he was demonstrating his dominion over both nature and nobles. A quirky tidbit: courtiers sometimes rehearse their bows and gestures before these promenades, terrified of slipping on the gravel or misjudging the depth of a bow. A stumble could be catastrophic for reputation. You imagine dukes practicing their nods in front of mirrors, whispering, "Don't trip, don't trip," like nervous actors before opening night. Even the gravel was raked daily to ensure no stone disrupted the king's stately rhythm. You walk in the king's shadow as he pauses at fountains that burst into life almost magically, though really workers hidden nearby were cranking valves to make the water leap as Louis passed. The trick was timing. The fountains didn't all run constantly, so attendants signaled ahead to create the illusion that the gardens themselves obeyed his presence. Historians still debate whether Louis knew the trick or genuinely enjoyed the illusion of command. Either way, he walked as though Neptune himself took orders. The sensory details overwhelm you. The scent of clipped boxwood, the spray of water catching sunlight, the rhythmic shuffle of shoes along gravel. Courtiers cluster politely at the edges, laughing a little too loudly when the king chuckles, leaning in whenever he glances their way. The promenade is less about stretching legs and more about seeing and being seen. Everyone present rehearses their role in the great ballet of power. There's even gossip woven into the walk. Which marquise was allowed closer to the king today? Which duchess drew his eye with a carefully chosen gown? You can almost feel the envy ripple through the crowd, subtle as the breeze, sharp as perfume. To you, though, it's all background noise, like overhearing muted conversation on a bus while you drift toward sleep. Occasionally, Louis pauses to remark on a flower bed or to gesture toward a statue. His words are brief, but courtiers hang on them like revelations. A nod at a rosebush might launch weeks of speculation. Was it admiration? Criticism? Some coded message about foreign policy disguised as horticulture? Scholars still argue whether the king's garden comments were ever sincere or always symbolic. For you, the promenade becomes a slow-motion dream. The repetition of footsteps crunching gravel is like a metronome guiding your breathing. The glint of sunlight on fountains blurs into a steady shimmer, a hypnotic glow. Even the smell of boxwood grows soft and sleepy, as if the hedges themselves are humming lullabies. By the time Louis turns back toward the palace, his wig unshaken, his lace untouched by dust, you feel the weight of ceremony pressing down like a heavy embroidered quilt. The promenade is complete. Nature has bowed, nobles have nodded, fountains have risen on cue, and you, weary traveler, have walked into yet another layer of ritual, each step quieter than the last, carrying you deeper into the drowsy rhythm of the Sun King's day. The gravel crunch of the promenade fades, and in its place comes the distant blare of horns and the excited whinnying of horses. You sense the energy shift. The gardens were about serenity and display, but now it's time for Louis XIV's greatest obsession: hunting. If Versailles was his stage, the forest was his playground, and you're about to trail along whether you're ready or not. The king adored the hunt, not as a leisure hobby, but as a daily ritual, a show of vigor and dominance. Attendants rush to prepare, saddles creak, and dogs bark furiously, straining at their leashes. You smell the musk of leather and the sharp tang of horse sweat before you even step outside. Louis XIV appears in riding attire, still decorated, of course, because even galloping through mud, the Sun King had to look like a portrait. Historians still argue whether his hunts were primarily about sport or about politics, since nobles were expected to join and display loyalty in the saddle. Either way, missing the hunt could mean missing influence. The mainstream fact: hunting wasn't just recreation. It was the central sport of the French monarchy, Louis rode almost daily, favoring stag hunts that stretched for hours. He prided himself on his endurance, often outlasting courtiers decades younger. Picture a monarch who sat through endless council meetings in the morning and then vaulted onto a horse to chase deer through the forest in the afternoon. Work-life balance, 17th century style. Now for a quirky tidbit, safety was questionable, to put it mildly. Courtiers sometimes injured themselves badly in the rush, and there are tales of nobles being trampled or tumbling spectacularly from their saddles, while Louis galloped on, barely glancing back. One chronicler even claimed a duke broke an arm but kept riding, terrified that quitting would be seen as disloyal. Imagine peer pressure so strong you'd ride one-handed just to keep up. You ride along, or at least you pretend, bouncing awkwardly in the saddle while the court surges forward like a river of horses. The horns echo, dogs howl, and the forest itself seems to bend to the frenzy. Branches whip past, hooves drum the earth, and somewhere ahead, a stag bursts into motion, the true star of the show. Louis presses his horse forward, his wig miraculously intact, while courtiers strain to stay near. Historians still debate how much hunting Louis actually did himself. Did he deliver the final spear thrust, or did attendants handle most of the chase? Reports vary, but Louis certainly wanted to be seen as the tireless huntsman, the embodiment of masculine authority. What mattered wasn't just the kill, but the spectacle of pursuit, the reminder that the king was both master of state and master of the wild. For you, though, the chase becomes strangely hypnotic. The horns repeat the same notes over and over, a medieval ringtone droning through the trees. The pounding of hooves settles into a rhythm. Thud, 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 steady as a heartbeat. Even the dog's frantic barks blur together into a single pulsing sound, lulling you like white noise. The adrenaline of the courtiers doesn't reach you. You're too far gone in the cadence of repetition. When at last the hunt reaches its climax, the stag cornered, the dogs baying, Louis leans forward in triumph. A flourish, a gesture, a symbolic end. The courtiers erupt in praise, voices ringing out as if they've just watched a play. You, however, are drifting at the edges of the forest, eyelids heavy, ears ringing with the lull of horns. The hunt ends not with chaos, but with ceremony. The stag is honored, the kill acknowledged as both necessity and performance. Horses snort, courtiers laugh too loudly, and Louis basks in the admiration that follows. Another ritual complete, another demonstration of royal energy. And as the sun tilts toward noon, you find yourself swaying gently in the saddle, lulled by the after rhythm of hooves and horns. For the king, it's proof of power. For you, it's just another steady drumbeat, rocking you deeper into drowsy surrender. The horns fade into the distance, the dogs are led away panting, and Louis XIV returns from the forest with a triumphant calm. Horses are unsaddled, boots are dusted, wigs are shaken free of stray leaves, and everyone reassembles for what is perhaps the most visibly dazzling part of the day, the midday meal. You're ushered back into the palace where the corridors smell of roasted meats and buttery sauces, where kitchens deep below thunder with clattering pans, and where the nobles prepare for another carefully scripted spectacle. The meal you're about to witness isn't private. It's practically a performance on stage. Known as the Grand Couvert, the king's noon feast was semi-public, meaning that courtiers and sometimes even commoners could stand and watch him eat. You slide in with the crowd, noting the way people crane their necks for a glimpse of silver platters. For Louis, food wasn't just nourishment. It was another way to embody the grandeur of the state. Mainstream fact: Louis XIV's midday meals were enormous affairs. Dozens of dishes were presented, from soups and roasts to pastries and exotic fruits. He was famous for his appetite, reportedly eating 4 full plates of food at one sitting, plus desserts. Physicians warned him, but he ignored them, leaning into indulgence as if gluttony itself were part of the crown jewels. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, people brought folding chairs to watch him chew. That's right, the king's eating was so theatrical that spectators treated it like dinner theater. A murmur would ripple through the crowd if he favored a dish, and cooks in the kitchens would record every preference, desperate to repeat the triumph. Imagine strangers showing up in your kitchen just to watch you demolish a sandwich. The sensory details are overwhelming. Platters are carried in like treasure chests, lids lifted with a flourish to release clouds of steam. The aroma of roasted venison, spiced sauces, and fresh bread fills the air, heavy enough to make your eyelids droop. Silverware clinks gently as Louis cuts into his meal, while attendants hover to replace dishes as soon as they're finished. The pace is steady. Bite, sip, gesture, bow. To you, it's like watching clockwork powered by gravy. Historians still argue whether Louis truly enjoyed the food, or whether it was another tool of theater. Some insist he ate with genuine gusto, licking his fingers and reaching for more. Others suggest he exaggerated his appetite to project vitality, a king who consumed as endlessly as the state consumed taxes. Either way, every bite reinforced his role as the Sun King, radiant even with grease on his chin. The courtiers play their parts too. Some whisper observations. He favored the pheasant today. He barely touched the tart. While others nod furiously at each mouthful as if they themselves were chewing in solidarity. You, wedged between a pair of duchesses craning for a better view, can't help but notice the absurdity. An entire audience watching a man bite into a chicken leg like it's the climax of a Shakespeare play. The rhythm of the meal grows hypnotic. Forks and knives scrape in measured beats. Goblets are lifted with practiced grace. And every gesture seems to fall into a slow cadence. The repetition pulls at your senses. Chew, swallow, sip, wipe. Again, again. It becomes less like a meal and more like a lullaby performed in cutlery. Every so often, Louis pauses to speak and the chamber stills. His comments may be as simple as good broth or as serious as a remark on politics, but either way, they echo through the crowd like royal edicts. Scholars still debate whether these mealtime remarks were spontaneous or carefully calculated. For the audience, though, they were scripture, no matter how banal. By the time the final platter is cleared and napkins collected, the room feels both sated and exhausted. The king leans back, signaling the end, and courtiers erupt into bows and murmured praise. For Louis, it's another victory, another ritual completed with precision. For you, it's been a warm, savory haze of clinks and murmurs, the cadence of a feast that lulled you almost as much as it fed him. The grand couvert is over. The crowd disperses, bellies still empty but imaginations full, and you drift with them, the echo of silverware still rattling like a lullaby in your mind. The feast dissolves into satisfied murmurs. Silver platters vanish down service corridors, and the courtiers shuffle into yet another chamber. But this time, there are no steaming roasts or gilded cups. Just a line of nobles waiting like supplicants at an oracle. This is the afternoon petition ritual when Louis XIV transforms from eater to judge, dispenser of favors and denials with the flick of a wrist. The room is quieter than the dining hall, though the energy hums with anticipation. Courtiers clutch folded papers, rehearsing pleas under their breath. Others stand with hands nervously clasped, hoping for nothing more than a nod or glance. You find your place against the wall, watching the nobles line up like contestants in a royal game show. Mainstream fact: Louis XIV received petitions almost daily. These could be requests for pensions, pardons, military commissions, or favors for family members. Everyone from dukes to struggling writers might try their luck, though only the highest ranked were granted direct access. Petitioning the king wasn't just a bureaucratic step, it was a chance to show loyalty, desperation, or both. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some petitioners tried to dress their requests with elaborate theatricality. A noblewoman once presented her plea wrapped in embroidered silk, hoping the decoration alone would catch the king's eye. Others used rhyme or clever phrasing like auditioning with a monologue. Imagine waiting months for your turn, then deciding the best way to stand out was to rhyme tax with relax. The ritual unfolds with a slow, steady rhythm. A secretary announces each petitioner. The noble steps forward, bows deeply, and reads or recites their plea. Louis listens, or at least he appears to. Sometimes he interrupts with a curt yes or no. Other times he waves them away without a word. Historians still argue whether he truly weighed each case or if decisions had already been made in backrooms. To the petitioners, though, every second of his attention is priceless. You notice the sensory details, the rustle of parchment as petitions are unfolded, the squeak of shoes on polished floors, the nervous coughs swallowed into sleeves. The king sits immovable, expression calm like a sunbeam, too bright to read. Courtiers strain to interpret every twitch of his hand, every flicker in his eyes. A nod might launch a career, a frown could end one. The repetition begins to lull you. Bow, speak, pause, answer. Bow, speak, pause, answer. The same sequence again and again, as though the chamber itself were a music box turning on its gears. The words blur together, pensions, debts, grievances, flatteries. Each plea is unique to its speaker, but the rhythm smooths them into sameness. You breathe in time with the petitions, exhaling as each noble steps back in relief or despair. One petition in particular draws your attention. A trembling officer begs for funds to repair a crumbling fortress. Louis nods slowly, makes a brief note, and waves him away. Was it approval? Rejection? Even historians still debate moments like this, poring over scraps of correspondence to guess what the king really decided. For you, the ambiguity feels like a lullaby. Answers soft, indefinite, slipping just out of reach. The line continues, courtiers inching forward, the ritual stretching long into the afternoon. You lean against the wall, eyelids heavy, the murmur of voices blurring into white noise. Even the scent of ink and candle wax grows soothing, like a faint perfume designed for sleep. Finally, the last petitioner bows, parchment folded back into nervous hands. Louis rises slightly, signaling the ritual's close. The courtiers scatter, some jubilant, others crestfallen, but all still orbiting around the same golden sun. The chamber grows quiet, the echoes of pleas fading like a lull in conversation. And you, drowsy traveler, find yourself drifting with the rhythm still in your ears. Bow, speak, pause, answer, like a chant that follows you out the door, carrying you further into the drowsy heart of Versailles. The petitions fade behind you, a trail of whispered hopes and denials. And now Versailles shifts into something lighter, though no less deliberate. It's time for the king's entertainments. You shuffle along candlelit corridors until the sound of strings and flutes begins to spill into the air, like perfume in musical form. Louis XIV adored performances, but not passively. He often starred in them, or at least ensured that every production somehow revolved around him. The chamber you enter glitters with chandeliers, the waxy scent of candles mixing with powdered wigs and the faint musk of velvet curtains. Courtiers take their places, fanning themselves with plumes, while musicians tune instruments with a soft cascade of plucks and sighs. Louis settles on a gilded chair, perfectly positioned to be both audience and centerpiece. You find a corner where you can sink into the shadows, listening as the first notes swell. Mainstream fact. Louis XIV was a lifelong patron of the arts. He sponsored composers like Lully, playwrights like Molière, and choreographers who built entire ballets around his image as the Sun King. He even performed as Apollo in his youth, glowing in golden costume, convincing everyone that the myth of the sun god was really just his autobiography in disguise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Rehearsals for these ballets often went on until midnight, with courtiers forced to dance alongside professionals. Some nobles groaned at the endless steps, but others treated it like the most glamorous networking event imaginable. There are stories of dukes collapsing backstage, wigs sliding off in sweaty heaps, while Louis continued with perfect composure. Imagine your boss inviting you to a mandatory dance-off, and your promotion depending on how gracefully you remembered the choreography. The performance begins. Dancers sweep across the stage in arcs as precise as the gardens outside. Musicians hum in unison, bows rising and falling like the breathing of a giant. Louis watches, serene, occasionally glancing sideways to gauge whether courtiers are enjoying it as much as they should. Historians still argue whether he loved the art itself or mainly loved being adored through it. Maybe both. When you star as Apollo, it's hard to separate aesthetic from ego. The rhythm of the performance catches you. Strings repeat their phrases like waves washing against the shore. Dancers step in mirrored patterns, lace and silk fluttering in slow synchronization. The scene is mesmerizing not just for its beauty, but for its predictability. Every note, every bow, every leap designed to repeat in hypnotic symmetry. You feel your own breath sinking to the violins. Whispers ripple through the audience when the plot of the play or ballet veers toward thinly veiled flattery. A conquering hero, a radiant sun, a kingdom basking in light. All stand-ins for the king himself. Courtiers nod furiously as though agreeing with the metaphor makes them part of it. You glance at Louis and he smiles faintly, basking in the glow of his own myth made visible. There's another detail scholars debate, whether courtiers genuinely enjoyed these entertainments or simply endured them for appearances. Some accounts describe roaring laughter at Moliere's comedies, while others hint at nobles sneaking yawns behind lace fans. You know the feeling. Sitting through a show where the plot is thin but the music steady, the repetition lulls you toward sleep. For you, this becomes less like watching a performance and more like floating in a dream. The violins are a soft hum, the dancer's steps like the ticking of a clock. Each bow of the cello draws you deeper, like a hand pulling you gently underwater. The applause that bursts at the end startles you, like waking from a nap you didn't realize you were having. Louis rises, satisfied. Another performance complete, another layer of himself glorified, another audience bathed in reflected light. The courtiers murmur their praises, some louder than necessary, while the musicians bow low, instruments resting against tired shoulders. You slip out with the others, ears still ringing with the steady pulse of strings, mind drifting in the rhythm of spectacle-turned lullaby. The applause fades, musicians pack away their bows and flutes, and courtiers scatter into side corridors like colorful moths, flitting from one candle to the next. For Louis XIV, the day's theater isn't finished. It simply changes costume. The king returns to his chamber, where the ritual of undressing begins, and you follow, the air growing thick again with powder and perfume. This is no casual unbuttoning at the end of a long day. Here, even removing a glove has the weight of ceremony. The evening dressing down, or déshabillé, is the mirror image of the morning's lever. Every layer that was laced and buckled hours ago now comes off, but never without an audience. Nobles hover at the ready, waiting for their chance to hold a sleeve, carry a cloak, or fold a stocking like it's the crown jewels. Mainstream fact: Louis XIV's coucher, the larger going-to-bed ceremony, was divided into stages, and this early undressing was part of the progression. Nobles were invited in tiers, with the most privileged closest to the king's body, literally measuring their influence by inches of proximity. The garments came off in reverse order of dressing, and each article was an opportunity for someone to demonstrate loyalty and importance. Now for a quirky tidbit. Sometimes the king changed outfits multiple times in one evening, depending on whether he was heading to supper, gambling, or a private audience. That meant nobles got repeated chances to handle fabric, and some apparently hoarded the moments like baseball cards. "I held his slipper on Tuesday," one might whisper. "Ah, but I folded his cravat on Thursday." Imagine office workers competing over who got to press send on the boss's emails. The chamber is hushed except for the faint scrape of buckles and the sigh of silk sliding off shoulders. You notice the sensory details, the powdery cloud rising as wigs are lifted, the faint creak of leather as shoes are unstrapped. the rustle of heavy brocade folding into neat piles. Courtiers bend low, their hands trembling slightly as they pass each garment along, terrified of dropping lace worth more than their entire estate. Historians still argue whether Louis enjoyed this constant ceremony or simply endured it for control's sake. Was he amused at the nobles bowing over his stockings or weary of the endless parade of fabric? Observers left conflicting reports, some claiming he relished every moment, others hinting he sometimes grew impatient. You, watching from the corner, can't tell for sure. His expression remained serene, trained by decades of performance. The rhythm of the ritual begins to soothe you. Buckle undone, shoe lifted, bow. Wig removed, powder shaken, bull. Each gesture repeated with delicate precision like the slow movements of a clock winding backward. The repetition draws you in, eyelids heavier with each exchanged garment. You imagine the hush of the chamber as a lullaby in itself, every rustle of fabric a verse, every bow a refrain. One noble fumbles slightly with a button, and a ripple of tension skates across the room. The mistake is minor, but the stakes are massive. Will Louis notice? Will the gossip spread? You stifle a yawn as the drama plays out, though in your ears it sounds more like the soft flutter of pages turning in a bedtime story. Finally, the king stands in lighter evening attire, still regal but softened. The heavy armor of the day is gone, replaced with something that looks almost comfortable, though still silk, still expensive, still calculated. The nobles murmur, bow again, and step back as the ritual concludes. The clothing lies folded, stacked, and guarded like treasure, waiting for the next round of ceremony. And you, swaying slightly, feel the rhythm settle into your bones. On-off bow, on-off bow. A cadence as steady as breathing, as ancient as ritual, carrying you deeper into the gentle hum of the Sun King's endless theater. The king is lighter now, freed from layers of gold thread and stiff brocade. And that means one thing: supper. You drift along with the tide of courtiers into another chamber, smaller than the hall of the Grand Couvert, but no less ceremonial. The evening meal is quieter, less of a spectacle than noon, but every spoonful still follows ritual choreography. A long table gleams with silver and porcelain, though this time fewer spectators crowd the room. The mood is hushed, intimate, yet still public enough that courtiers hover at the edges, eager for scraps of approval. You notice the way candles flicker against mirrored walls, doubling the glow until the whole room seems caught in twilight. The king takes his seat, and suddenly the silence feels like the hush before an orchestra begins. Mainstream fact: supper at Versailles was a daily ritual, served at 10 o'clock in the evening, and it was every bit as structured as the midday feast. Dishes arrived in procession, though often lighter fare: soups, poultry, tarts. The king's appetite remained hearty, but the focus was less on quantity than on timing, as if the rhythm of eating itself set the palace clock. Here's a quirky tidbit. Louis sometimes ate alone at supper, with courtiers simply standing and watching in respectful silence. Other nights, close family might be allowed to sit with him, but they still observed strict etiquette. There are accounts of the king cutting his own meat, which shocked onlookers. It was considered almost scandalously casual. Imagine people gossiping furiously because you dared to use your own fork. The sensory details begin to lull you. Platters arrive with a faint clatter, lids lifted to release puffs of steam. The air smells of roasted fowl and buttered vegetables, softened by the sweetness of wine. Silver utensils scrape gently against porcelain, the rhythm steady and predictable. Courtiers whisper at the edges, trading gossip under their breath. Who stumbled in the hunt today? Who seemed favored in the petition chamber? Who might be falling from grace? Versailles is a palace built on whispers, and supper is fertile ground for them. Historians still argue whether Louis truly relished these evening meals or whether they were just another cog in the wheel of ritual. Some claim he enjoyed the smaller setting, the comfort of family presence. Others suggest he was weary, eating quickly so the routine could move forward. Watching him now, you can't decide. His expression is serene, composed yet faintly detached, like a man eating and performing at the same time. The rhythm takes hold again. Lift, cut, chew, sip. Lift, cut, chew, sip. The repetition is hypnotic, the kind of steady pattern that could lull even the most alert observer. You find yourself swaying slightly, the scrape of silver and the low hum of voices weaving together into a bedtime song. One detail catches your eye. A servant carefully wipes the king's goblet before pouring wine, not once but 3 times, each action exaggerated so the courtiers see the care taken. It's part hygiene, part performance, part paranoia. The motion repeats at each refill, another cycle in the choreography of supper. You can almost time your breathing to it. Inhale on the wipe, exhale on the pour. As the final course is cleared, perhaps a tart, perhaps fruit glistening with sugar, the king signals the end. Napkins are folded, silver whisked away, candles adjusted for the soft descent into the next ritual. The courtiers bow, the room exhales, and the evening meal dissolves into murmurs and shadows. For Louis, supper has reaffirmed order. For the nobles, it has provided another chance to measure favor in the tilt of a spoon. For you, though, it has been a lullaby disguised as dinner, a cadence of clinks and whispers carrying you deeper into drowsiness. The meal is finished, but the night still stretches ahead, velvet wrapped and heavy with ceremony. The plates are cleared, the silver stacked away, and now Versailles slides into its most shadowed hours. Supper may have quieted the palace, but Louis XIV's evenings were far from finished. You trail behind him into richly draped salons, where the glow of candles reflects off gilt mirrors, multiplying the light until the room seems endlessly deep. Here the king indulges in diversions, cards, dice, conversation, and sometimes secret visits that blurred the line between duty and desire. The atmosphere is different now. Formal bows relax slightly, voices grow warmer, and the tension of petitions and councils is replaced with the easy shuffle of cards. Courtiers cluster around tables, each hoping for the chance to play against the king himself. You watch as Louis sits, steady hands arranging cards with the same gravity he gave to state papers. Winning mattered less than the ritual of playing, though no one dared let him lose too often. Historians still argue whether he genuinely enjoyed gambling or whether it was just another social stage where proximity equaled power. Mainstream fact: Louis XIV regularly played games like Basset and Lansquenet, both popular card games of the era. These games involved high stakes, and fortunes could be won or lost in an evening. But the real prize wasn't money, it was visibility, the chance to be noticed by the king while sharing a table. Here's a quirky tidbit. Louis had a famously good poker face long before poker existed. Observers claimed he could sit silently through entire games, revealing nothing but the occasional twitch of his lips. Courtiers, meanwhile, often fumbled under the pressure, sweating into their lace cuffs. You imagine a duke losing half his fortune while still smiling desperately, whispering, "What a great honor to be ruined by His Majesty." The sensory details wrap around you. The slap of cards on polished wood, the clink of coins stacked neatly, the low murmur of bets placed and lost. Candles flicker, wax pooling in ornate holders, and shadows dance along the walls like conspirators. The repetition becomes soothing. Shuffle, deal, bet, fold. Shuffle, deal, bet, fold. It's a lullaby disguised as a card game, each round rocking you further toward drowsiness. Sometimes the king sets aside cards for conversation. Courtiers lean in, eager to catch his words, while the rest hang back, pretending not to listen but straining their ears anyway. Gossip swirls. Who has fallen out of favor? Which marriage is being arranged? What scandal might quietly disappear into the night? You can almost feel the whispers brushing against your skin, soft as moth wings. And then there are the visits. Historians still debate the nature of Louis's late-night wanderings. Some accounts speak of discreet meetings with mistresses. Others have long conversations with trusted ministers. What's certain is that these hours were cloaked in velvet secrecy, the palace buzzing with speculation each morning. To you, the rumors are no more than soft echoes, part of the drowsy hum of the night. The repetition of the games continues until the hours stretch long and indistinct. Cards slap, coins clink, courtiers laugh a little too loudly. The rhythm doesn't speed up or slow down, it just persists, steady as a metronome. You breathe in time with it, eyelids heavy, swaying gently like a spectator at a concert who's drifted into half-sleep. At last the king rises. The games end instantly, the room bowing to his movement. Coins are swept aside, cards stacked neatly, candles trimmed. Louis glides out, leaving behind nobles whispering furiously about who lost, who won, who smiled, and who scowled. You follow, floating on the soft after-sound of shuffles and whispers, knowing the final ritual of the day still awaits. The palace is quiet now, corridors glowing dimly, footsteps muffled on thick carpets. The late-night diversions are over, but the night itself isn't finished until the coucher closes the curtain on the royal day. The palace is hushed as if holding its breath. The games are over, the gossip trails into corners, and now the last ritual of the day begins. The coucher, the king's public going-to-bed ceremony. You shuffle once more into the royal bedchamber where candles glow in steady rows and the air feels thick with anticipation. For most people, slipping into bed is private. For Louis XIV, it's a performance, the final act in a play that has lasted from sunrise to midnight. The king enters, attendants flowing around him like shadows. His towering wig is gone, his attire softened to silk robes, but the gravity of the ritual remains. Nobles file in, each knowing exactly where to stand, each waiting for a chance to participate. Even bedtime is a ladder of influence. One man offers slippers, another folds a robe, a third draws the curtain around the massive bed. Mainstream fact: the coucher was divided into two ceremonies. The petit coucher allowed the closest attendants and family into the intimate space, while the grand coucher opened the ritual to a wider audience of courtiers. This meant that Louis's most private act, going to sleep, was staged twice nightly, a living reminder that his life was the property of the state. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes Louis didn't even sleep in the bed he was ceremoniously tucked into. After the ritual, he might retreat to a smaller private chamber, leaving the grand state bed empty until morning. The nobles, however, still treated the coucher with awe, as though the bed itself radiated majesty, whether or not the king actually used it. Imagine a sleepover where your friends tuck you in, then you sneak to the couch for comfort. The sensory details swirl around you. The scrape of chairs as nobles position themselves. The hushed murmur of Latin prayers, the soft swish of silk curtains drawn shut. The repetition is steady. Bow, gesture, robe. Bow. Courtiers step forward, perform their duty, step back. Each action feels like a note in a lullaby, guiding you toward the end of the day. Historians still argue whether Louis found the coucher exhausting or empowering. Some accounts describe him smiling faintly as courtiers jostled for the honor of holding his candlestick. Others suggest he longed for solitude, for a night without 100 eyes on his pillow. Watching him now, it's impossible to know. His face is calm, trained, unreadable, as he accepts each bow like the rhythm of the universe itself. The ritual stretches, but it doesn't drag. It moves with a cadence as natural as breathing. A chamberlain folds the bedclothes. A noble bows low to present a rosary. An attendant smooths the pillow, hands trembling at the proximity. You watch as the final curtain is drawn, candlelight flickering softly on gilded wood. The king is now asleep, at least in the eyes of his court. The nobles bow one last time, their movements slow, reverent, and you feel the weight of silence settle over the room. The Sun King's day has closed, wrapped in ceremony from waking lever to final coucher. For you, the repetition, the hush, the soft scrape of silk, and the fading candlelight combine into the gentlest of lullabies. The performance is complete, the curtain falls, and all that remains is the long, quiet drift into dreams. Now the palace lies still. The candles burn lower, their flame steady but small, like the last notes of a song winding into silence. The long day of rituals has finished, every bow and whisper folded neatly into memory. What remains is calm, the hush of corridors, the distant rustle of trees beyond the windows, the softest echo of footsteps already fading away. You breathe slower now, the rhythm of the Sun King's day melting into your own. The repetition of rituals, wake, dress, eat, walk, hunt, feast, play, sleep, has softened into a gentle circle, rocking you like a cradle. You no longer need to follow the courtiers, no longer need to count the bows or watch the plates. The story drifts to its end, leaving you safe in its quiet. The room around you feels warm, as if the velvet curtains of Versailles have drawn close. You hear only the faint hum of silence, like the air itself is resting. Each detail that was once sharp, buckles, wigs, silver spoons, has blurred into softness, their edges dissolving. You are no longer in the palace. You are somewhere quieter, deeper, where even history itself falls asleep. So let your eyelids rest. Let the rhythm of the day settle into your breathing, long and slow, steady as the footsteps on gravel, gentle as the clink of silver on porcelain. You've followed the king through every hour, every ceremony, and now there is nothing left but peace. Sleep, knowing the story will keep repeating, steady as the sun rising and setting over Versailles. The king is at rest, the palace is at rest, and now, so are you.